Welcome to the Public Voice Salon. We're an on-air dialogue on education, the arts, and social change. My name is John Bredin. I am a teacher, a writer, and an activist. And tonight we are so honored to be with Professor Bertell Ollman, who is one of the leading Marxist professors and scholars in the world. He's definitely one of the leading dialecticians in the world, and we're going to learn on our program what that word means, dialectician. I'm very intrigued by that. I'd like to learn more about it myself. And also, Bertell has had a long and illustrious career as a professor at NYU. He was the inventor of a board game, the first Marxist board game, like a Marxist version of Monopoly, kind of. And I think his work is so important, especially nowadays, if we look at the political system and we see the failures and the problems with capitalism. We're looking at an election where Republicans swept into power with all that big money behind them from right-wing donors and billionaires. So we want to start off with Bertell, just to say welcome to the Public Voice Salon. It's an honor to have you with us tonight, sir, and we really appreciate your work, your amazing work, your important work on Marxism that continues. Just to educate our public in general, who might not have a strong background in Marxism, because we know the education system is getting more dumbed down these days. That's one of the topics that we like to cover on our show. I'm a professor of English at Essex County College in Newark, and I've been adjunct professor now for 10 years, and I can see how they're stressing more, kind of moving away from the humanities and focusing more on business and marketing type stuff, So there's a lot of people out there who have not had the benefit of being enriched in their knowledge of what Marxism is. So we want to educate our public a little bit about, just in general, to start us off, in your opinion, what is Marxism and why it's needed today more than ever?
The place to begin, of course, is in the writings of Karl Marx. His writings and the writings of his close collaborator, Friedrich Engels, are being put together now in what they hope, the people who are doing this, will be the first complete edition of his writings, published and unpublished. They expect to have, when they're finished, something between 130 and 140 volumes of works which will have on the average 500 to 700 pages each. He and his collaborator Friedrich Engels did an awful lot of writing, and it covered many different subjects, but by far the most important subject for him, particularly from, one can say, the time of the Communist Manifesto, that's 1848 on, to his death in 1883, particularly capitalism. What is capitalism? How does it work? Who does it work better for? Who does it work worse for? Where did it come from? How did it develop? And where does it seem to be heading? Those are the key questions that he addressed in his attempt to understand capitalism. Now, I think it is true that there's no other thinker who took on this subject in quite that way. And the reason it's so important is because we not only still live in a capitalist society, but if anything, our society and indeed our entire world has become more capitalist in ways which maybe we can bring out later than it was before. And that being the case, in order to understand the system in which we live, in order to see who benefits from it most, who loses out. Now, some of that is pretty obvious now, especially, but some of the things that come out of that, because you have to see how that plays out, not just in the economy, but in politics, and you suggested one way it plays out in politics in referring to what happened in the last election, but also how it plays out in the media, how it plays out in culture generally, how it plays out in the educational system, that by now you find the evidence for capitalism, part of how it works indeed. You find it in, well, wherever you look. And this it makes it essential that those of us who are not satisfied, and I think most of us are not, although we're not quite sure who to blame, with the way our system seems to be working, need to understand the fullest and I think most correct analysis of the system that was ever made. Now, if I can just go on one step further here, because you did ask for short answers, but you did recognize that answers can be quite long as well.
This is a man who could talk for 3 hours on any of these questions easily. I've seen you in action, Bertell, at the Left Forum. You're a wonderful orator. You're a wonderful lecturer. We're in more of a dialogue here, but I think also you can give mini lectures. Let's put it that way. How about mini lectures?
Okay. I do want to say, because I said that was something that was written 100+ years ago, that this has more to teach us about the system in which we live than the writings of any of our contemporaries. How could that be so? Well, here I would give two answers which sound like they're contradictory, but they really are complementary. One is that the world has obviously changed a great deal since Marx wrote, and in the way the economy is organized, in the way the state works, in the role of the state in the economy, in the globalized character of politics, and especially of economic life, and in all that's happened in the development of technology and so on. Now, this needs to be recognized. Given that, I would go on to say, and the capitalist world has changed not at all, or hardly at all. Now, this does seem like a contradiction, doesn't it? Okay, what I mean, though, is this, that the structures of capitalism, what are the structures of capitalism? That almost all of the production takes place by work.
Are they coming for us, Bertell?
Maybe.
Okay.
Maybe. I've gotten to the hot part.
I'm only the host. Okay.
That's one of the ways in which capitalism hasn't changed, unfortunately. So that the work is being done by people who don't have the wherewithal to live unless they find a job and someone who's willing to pay them a salary for doing work. And everything that they produced is not theirs. They have no rights to it. It goes into to the capitalist who hires them, and from there into a market, and anybody with money can go in and buy it, including them if they have enough money. And this relationship between the people who produce the goods that we all use and the capitalist who hires them and pays a wage for their work and takes control of the goods, and the role that the market plays as the place that these goods end up and they're available to anybody that can pay for it. And the fact that money today, far more than in Marx's day, can buy virtually everything, that the power of money has grown considerably. These kinds of connections didn't exist in feudalism. These kinds of connections didn't exist in slave society. These are, you could view these as different functions of the capitalist system, which are structural. They didn't exist in feudalism, slave society, or in a real socialist society. They wouldn't exist. And consequently, in these ways, we still have very much a capitalist society. And when Marx analyzed capitalism, it was these structures which he gave most of his attention to. He did examine those characteristics which were different in each stage of the evolution of this structure, so that capitalism goes through various stages within the capitalist epoch, and the differences between these stages are very important, particularly for the kind of politics that exists at each stage and the opportunities they offer or don't offer to people to change the whole system. But while the changes on what you might say in each of the current or modern periods within the whole era of capitalism, which extends several hundred years, they have changed, but the structures have not. And we must understand the structures first and most to make sense of capitalism, to know how to change it, and to know what to change it into. And the crisis gives us our most striking example of why this is true, which I hope leads into your next question: why the crisis? How the crisis?
Well, I just have to respond to you, Bertell, by saying that, we believe in democracy on our program, and I, in my own life, as a teacher, as an English professor, I always arrange our chairs in a circle so we could see eye to eye and we could have a democratic dialogue and discourse. My looking around society today, and when you look at the inequality of wealth that's become just so incredible with the 1% of the 1% and how much money they have, billions and billions just stashed away that they're never going to spend, and the great mass of society just sort of rushing from here to there, overworked. People are exhausted when they come home from work. They don't have an analysis of what's going on. They've been deprived of an education. It seems like very frustrating in terms of an uphill battle. Now I come into this office here and I see these wonderful books and the feeling and the intellectual integrity and the spirit, and I say, I wish we could get these ideas out there to a larger public. But I think one of the problems is, and I have to be honest, that in academia, the discourse can be very jargonesque. And how do we overcome that? I mean, you're a guy that you invented a board game. Claudia, take a look up there. Just point the camera, maybe, if you can. Look at all these. This was the first Marxist board game called Class Struggle. As a kid, I used to play Monopoly as a kid, right? So this is the Marxist version of Monopoly. So it seems that you're like a popular educator in a way. Do you have any criticisms of some of your colleagues, maybe, who make it seem very difficult, this concept? Because Marxism, on a surface level, it seems to be very simple. Share the wealth, right? Why do we have to make it so abstract that people can't understand?
Well, I did say that capitalism has become more capitalist in the last 100 years. There wasn't a culture which extended as far as our culture does into all areas of a person's life. We didn't have mass spectator sports to make people forget their daily problems, a kind of opium, if you will. Marx talked about the opium, religion being one opium of the people. We have a half a dozen opiums which are at least as strong now.
Kim Kardashian and Snooki and...
Yes, and mass spectator sports, and in the academy, we didn't have in the United States much of an academy, just getting started really toward the end of Marx's life, and now it's well developed. But it's also one of its main features is that it's broken knowledge, where everything is more or less interrelated. In our lives, if you just think about any important problem you have, it has aspects which are economic, aspects which are psychological, aspects which are political, perhaps cultural, and so on. In the academy, all this is divided not only into different disciplines, but each discipline is divided into sub-disciplines. Each sub-discipline has its different programs, and they've broken up a world which we live in and experience as only through its interconnectedness. It's broken it up into a number of separate pieces which are kept separate when people investigate them, and that's the surest way to keep people from understanding any of them, because they can only be understood in terms of their interconnectedness and in terms of their history. Look, in the politics department, we really don't study history. We once did, and not just in this department, but in the whole discipline. There's a fellow in this department which, about 25 years ago, wrote a thesis on the history of political science textbooks, Introduction to American Government type books, in the discipline from the beginnings, which are in the early 20th century, to today. Today was like 1970s, 1975. And what he discovered is that from a time when the history of politics, not the little bit on not the copy of the Constitution in the appendix, but the history of politics took up from a third to half of any and every political science textbook. It got slowly, they received less and less space as we move forward. And by the 60s and 70s, there was hardly any history. And now I think most textbooks would not have any history of politics in their discussion of what politics is and how it works, and what has happened to politics. It's been limited by most of the main the mainstream in our discipline to certain features of what goes on in political life, and in this case having to do with how people make their decisions. Now, it is interesting how people make their decisions, but to make that the main subject tends to underplay, if not dismiss at all, the various contexts, overlapping contexts, and the history of whatever it is they're making their decisions over, which one must have some grasp of in order to see how they make their decisions and why they make their decisions and what effect their decisions have. And so there's a kind of not so much movement to the right in the academy, although that's happening too, but a kind of trivialization of what it means to understand anything.
Yeah.
And of course, their understanding of science, which is heavily mathematics, mathematics, which maybe have a place in some approaches, but this becomes almost the only way in which they believe that you can do scientific work in the discipline. Now, I'm afraid something like this has happened to varying degrees to most disciplines. In economics, it may even be worse than in political science. But what this has meant is that and people are trained in this, and this is what gets them their jobs, and this is what gets them promotions and their good salaries, so that most people don't want to rock the boat, even though I think they feel uncomfortable. In fact, there was a study made 30 years ago about people in political science, which showed that something like 2/3, I think that was the percentage of the people who were practicing political scientists, who said that most of what they did was trivial, and using various kinds of jargon. And this is how they characterized their own work. They went back on Monday morning and did more of the same, because partly they were worried about their careers if they did otherwise, and partly because they didn't know quite what otherwise meant at that point, and still don't, because there really isn't the kind of open discussion of methods and different approaches to how to study our society, in this case politics, but applies to most other fields as well, that there needs to be if we were the kind of scholars that I'm afraid most people in the academy pretend to be.
Let me just digest all that and make a dialectical response. That one of the things I thought of when you were speaking about the interconnectedness of problems in terms of psychological and people's mental health and the rise of depression today. One of our former guests on our show was Harriet Fraud, who was a psychotherapist, and she talks about how the United States has only 5% of the world's population, but we consume 66% of the psychological medications. Now, Harriet's husband, Rick Wolff, the economist, has talked about how he's attended very prestigious universities like Yale University, but he learned most of his Marxism outside of the academy. So do you think what's happening now is are the powers that be, let's say, trying to put the kibosh on Marx and Marxism, and if we go into the future, they're going to try to expunge this from the curriculums?
Well, they always have to some degree. I mean, the people who run the country, the 1%, they have never been comfortable with any analysis which rips off even part of the mystification, the disguises, the ways in which what's really happening to people is hidden in plain sight. The sum of what I'm describing is Marx calls ideology. So any attempts to do that and no school of thought does that more fully and more consistently and with greater danger for the system than Marxism. So of course they've been uncomfortable and in different ways have kept people from getting into the job of teaching, to get jobs or to get promoted or to do what they wanted to do when they were teaching. And this has been now it's irregular, and it's not as complete yet. But I think still the tendencies are moving in that direction, especially with the using the corporate model for organizing the university, which is trying to turn the universities, which does have occasionally ideas which call into question the status quo in all disciplines that exists. But they are trying to turn universities into training schools for what their capitalist employers would like, not only in terms of skills, but in terms of attitudes, in terms of the attitudes which make them good, cooperative, and docile employees for their capitalist employers. And I think that is a tendency which has gotten started everywhere, including in NYU, and that is very dangerous. And it's being fought, of course, by a great many people, both students and faculty, but who is going to win this battle is still up in the air. And of course, they have all the big guns in the battle.
But so for a long time,
In short, the academy is also one of the main sites of the class struggle.
so it's the academy is involved, the media is involved, so there's a cultural component here, what people consume when they go to the movies and what they watch on television. That serves as a kind of educational vehicle, as well as the colleges themselves. I know I teach at Essex County College, and I find even there's a growing corporatization. It seems to be more growing sterility, let's just say, even in the English department, that you do it this way or else kind of thing, where there used to be more of an openness, and I'm feeling that pressure. Will there be vestiges, you think, where like some progressive departments that will remain, or how, in terms of, are you getting pressure here?
No, I've been around a long time, and I've written lots of books, and I'm sort of protected, but I don't have the kind of access, let's say, to graduate students in the PhD program that some other colleagues of equal academic standing have, because what I'm doing, it's not said to be my politics. It's supposed to be because I have a method of approach which is not scientific. It's a Marxist method, and it's dialectics, and that is not just thought of serious. So that's another way in which you can dismiss rivals who are at base really political rivals, but you can dismiss it on grounds which don't sound political. Because academic freedom is very important, and it's been undermined, attacked, and destroyed in a variety of ways. It's not just by firing people or not hiring people. There's all sorts of more subtle ways to make sure that what gets taught is of a kind which doesn't ruffle too many feathers. First of all, in terms of the people, the administration of the university, then beyond that, the board of trustees of the university, then beyond that, the capitalist class and the government, which makes the broad rules of the game in which all the lower down players must follow.
Well, you were involved in a situation like that with the University of Maryland, when they actually hired you to teach, to be the chair of the Department of Government, and there was an article published by, I think it was Evans and Novak. They were the renowned journalists for the Washington Post, and they criticized you as indoctrinating your students or some nonsense, and then the university revoked your chairmanship. How did you respond to that?
Well, first of all, it wasn't just Evans and Novak. It began in an interesting way, because I never saw myself as a chair of a department. They sought me out. I wasn't interested in looking for another job. I was at NYU. And they sought me out, and they talked me into coming for an interview, which I did because I had a couple of friends there, and they insisted that I come, that they wanted to talk to me about a variety of things. Anyway, I went, and surprisingly, various members of the administration were very excited with the possibility of bringing in not just me, but a Marxist chair. And the reason for it, I think, had to do with they were hoping that it would make them stand out in the academy. It certainly did.
Marxism is still a sign of prestige.
In the minds of these two particular administrators, not the chancellor of the campus and the dean of of the social sciences. Now, when I took the job, because it was for various reasons, it was a very interesting job. I took it. Oh, I should say, by the way, that the people who were responsible for calling me to be interviewed and who voted for me represented the great majority of the department, with just a couple of dissenters out of a department, I think, of 46 at the time. And they And none of them were Marxists. There were some people who were progressive, and none of them were into the Marxist approach. So I was very pleased that America had arrived at that point after McCarthy where something like that could happen, because this would have made me the first Marxist chair of an important political science department of the country. That was one of the reasons I took it. I thought this was a mark of progress in terms of the openness of people to different points of view. And then there were 10 columnists, not just Evans and Novak, which wrote columns denouncing the university, denouncing me, and as a result of the hullabaloo created by these 10 different columnists, most of them from the Washington area, because the campus is really in a suburb of Washington, D.C., the governor held a press conference and denounced the university. The university then got something like 36 letters from various members of the legislature, threatening them, not only damning them, but even threatening their ability to get money for the baseball and football team. I mean, they were playing hardball. This was very serious.
I thought McCarthyism was over in the 50s.
Talking about McCarthyism, one of the members of the Board of Trustees turned out to be J. Edgar Hoover's younger brother.
Please, that explains it. Okay.
Well, I don't know how dominant he was, but that might have been typical. Anyway, the new president came in, and he seemed to have made a deal with the Board of Trustees to reject me, but he wouldn't say why. He says for the best interests of Ollman, he's not going to say why. He was saving my reputation. Anyway, so I sued them, and three years later went to court, and the judge, who was the brother of the biggest banker in Maryland, bad choice of a judge, he went along with their stand, and the conclusion was, because I was suing both presidents, the one who resigned and the new one, he said people with such illustrious histories in the academy, they had been presidents of other universities for a long time, and looking like they did. They both had white hair, which and always dressed in a very spiffy manner, looking the way. And he went on, and one who had been at Oxford. I was also at Oxford, but
yes.
he didn't mention that, the judge. But one of them had been at Oxford. He said such people, not these people, such people could not have given sham reasons for their actions. So they won based upon the fact that such people never lie. And the Supreme Court wouldn't hear the case. We tried to appeal it, and they wouldn't hear the case.
That was not a good day for democracy. That was not a good. Or for academic freedom. Absolutely, absolutely.
I've experienced this kind of thing in a few places. Yeah.
Let's try to think positive, though, because now over in Seattle you have a socialist council person who was elected there, and they just celebrated their very first Indigenous Peoples Day instead of Columbus Day. You had an Occupy movement in the United States, which was very galvanizing, after which they did a poll, and they found that a surprisingly large number of young people are now favorable to socialism. In France, there's a socialist president there. So the fight is not up yet. But it seems from our conversation here that I'm getting a deeper sense also that there is a battleground in our university system and in our society, that these ideas are being fought out. And, it was interesting that you actually got onto the Sean Hannity show. I found that very interesting. And you got on there because of a mistake, because he thought that he was one of your students and that you gave him a bad grade, and he had you come on the show because he wanted to yell at you for giving him a bad grade. And he was with Combs that time, when he had Hannity and Combs was on your side, and he said, yeah, you should have given him a worse grade, he said.
Yeah, no, I think I said that too, but I was kidding, because it turned out that he never was my student. And of course, I wouldn't have survived at all in the academy if there were a lot of students complaining about getting bad grades because of their politics. I'm very, very careful to not to leave any suspicion of that when I grade the students. But there was this error, and I guess I took advantage of it to have a chance to tell the listeners, this few million people who get their news from Fox News, about Democracy Now! I managed to pull out a piece of paper which said, are you tired of, bad news, see Democracy Now! And he tried to pull the paper out of my hand at the end of the interview, and I pulled back, and we ended up in a tug of war. His last comments, all you socialists want is free publicity. And I had a chance for what I thought would be the best comeback, and I'll give it to you now because
Go ahead.
the program ended before I could say
Okay,
it.
here we go.
And I was going to say, and why not? All publicity should be free. Anyway.
But that was now, wouldn't you think that Rachel Maddow would want you to come on since, CNBC is supposedly of the left, right?
I think you got to distinct. There's lots of places to draw lines between different kinds of socialists and communists, and not only between socialists, but between different kinds of communists. And I am not simply a reformer. I mean, I think capitalism has to be done away with lock, stock, and barrel. And you mentioned that the president of France is a socialist. He's a social democrat. And the difference between, I suppose now I would call myself a communist. I was uncomfortable calling myself a communist when there was still a Soviet Union, because though I saw many positive features in what happened in Russia and indeed in communist China, there were many things I was critical of, and I didn't want to be put in the position of having to defend the things they thought were bad mistakes. But now that both those countries are capitalist countries, I'm willing to say that, well, Marx was a communist, and I'm a communist in the way that Marx was. Which was to say that I think capitalism as a whole is simply not just a bad idea, but a dangerous one, especially now with climate change kicking in. And capitalism is responsible for so many of our problems, either by itself or has the main responsibility. That and they're all getting worse. It's not as if we've arrived at the bottom of the hole. And this being the case, so we don't have much time not just to create a better society, but to create a survivable society, a society which will continue to be a place for our species if we don't create a system where the government deals with social needs. And there's no greater need than dealing quickly, immediately, with all that can be done to stop the climate change in its tracks to the extent that's possible, to provide decent, well-paying, safe jobs for everybody who wants one. And that is possible. That definitely is possible.
With a shorter work week too, Bertell?
Definitely.
What would be the ideal number of working hours per person?
Certainly more than half certainly less than half of what people are now working today. Marx, and the only time, this is quite simple. Look, Marx talks about communism. There's no place where Marx describes his vision of communism. But what he does say is, in a number of places, he gives you what he talks about as seeds or sprouts of communism in the present. And of those sprouts, I mean, workers' cooperatives a sprout, trade unions are a sprout, number of other things. Now, these are not going to be in that form in communism, but these are ways of showing workers and people and everybody can get together, discuss their problems, and themselves decide what needs to be done. And one of the sprouts, oddly enough, is unemployment. Big unemployment, such as it happens in a depression. How can
the system needs to have unemployment? Capitalism requires unemployment.
Capitalism is all about the people with the power maximizing their profits, doing what's ever necessary. The first thing they think of, and the easiest thing for them to do, is to get their workers to get less pay and to lay those off, which have been replaced by the developments in technology. Both of these are happening at a rapid pace right now in an economic crisis. But the number of people who don't have jobs represents an enormous opportunity to reduce everybody's work in a planned society. Because one of the things we plan for is to provide everyone with a job. So we have, including the ex-capitalists, including the ex-lawyers and the ex-accountants and the ex-stockbrokers who have no place in a communist society because they don't produce anything of value. All of these people would contribute, along with the unemployed, along with the part of time employed who would like full-time jobs, would participate in one of the many kinds of jobs which would be available, and they would choose them, of course. And what you would have is the people who now work, and by the way, the wages that would be received would be as much, at least, as what the people with full-time jobs are getting, and better, of course, than the wages that are being paid to people with full-time jobs in the fast food industry. And everybody would be working much, much less because there'd be so many people actually contributing to the kind of work which needs to be done. So in a way, you see an opportunity here. If the society has changed and we do away with a system where a small number of people thinking only of maximizing profits control what goes on in all of these areas of life, starting with the area of the economy, because that's where their wealth comes from, when it's their wealth which gives them power in politics and the media and everywhere else, in the academy and everywhere else. There's just no reason. There's no rational reason for that happening.
Society.
Humane reason for that happening.
I think the clock is ticking down when you're talking about environmental catastrophe that we're facing, and that climate march that we had 2 months ago shed light on that. If you look at the people like the Walton family, 12 people in one family who have more wealth than 150 million people. Is that rational? Is that sane to have so few people have so much money? Could we maybe, Bertell, call for a cap on income or a cap on how much money any person is allowed to have?
Look, if someone is hurting very badly, an aspirin or any kind of painkiller will be useful, or wiping his brow would also be useful, and nurses do that. Those are minor, sometimes unfortunately trivial changes, which not only don't deal with the problem, but don't keep the problem from getting worse. Because right now, it's the system which is based upon people investing, using the wealth we have in order to make more wealth, that this incentive, profit maximization for us as an incentive, simply gets people to make the laws which are going to allow them to do terrible things to most of the rest of us, and to, as we see, the climate and to much else in the world. But it's also going to get them to break the laws when they can't have their way with the law, and do all sorts of things to keep this going. There's just no way of stopping this monster, because the system's become a monster, and there's just no way of stopping the monster other than by replacing it. Now, replacing it doesn't mean throwing people in jail or killing anybody, and it doesn't even mean that we have to forego our democratic system, because Marx says in at least two places, speaking to large groups of workers, that he thinks democracy could be useful as a way, and could be the way, to bring about a socialist society. And he mentions in those two lectures, he mentions 3 countries where he thought democracy had already evolved far enough and be used for enough different kinds of problems, where you could, in those countries, use that democratic system to make the changes. One was Holland, the other was Great Britain, and the third was the United States. Now, having said that, he wasn't naive to think that it was definitely going to be done in that way, because the capitalists don't really believe in democracy, and when they come close of losing, whoops, there happens the Chile coup, and there happens other coups and other distortions of democracy, like is happening in America with voting. We're in the process of whatever was fair and honest about our voting system, and it did have such elements, are being taken away, disintegrated, disguised. And right now there must be up to, 8, 10, maybe 12 different ways in which the voters are being screwed around with, kept from actually getting to the polls, delivering their vote, and having their vote counted. And the one which I think of as the most dangerous, because it's the one that's least talked about, because after this election there's been a number of comments on the different things the Republicans have done, is stealing of the electronic votes, because there's been so many experts which have spoken about how unsafe these electronic voting machines are. And the people who own most of the machines in the country are a couple of right-wing Republican families who have declared that it's impossible, have said the government is not allowed to go in to look in the mechanics and the cards in the machine which determine how the machine works, because it's private property. So believe it or not, these hundreds, I believe it's now maybe hundreds of millions of votes, around 100 million votes which are cast on these machines, we don't know, the government doesn't know, which means then the people don't know of what goes on inside those machines, because the owners of the machines declare it's their private property, and of course the government, of course, doesn't go near that, even for the safety of such things as national elections. And so you see such things as the following. Incidentally, I gave a course at NYU with another professor, Mark Crispin Miller, who wrote a book.
He's big on the voter issue. That's his thing.
He wrote a wonderful book called Fooled Again. And then he and I gave a course here, co-taught a course called How to Steal an Election, where we went through all the different ways in which students could, if they wanted to, steal elections. And the powers that be in the university were a little uncomfortable with the title of our course, but we're both tenured professors, so we pushed back and we said, look, we're not being biased, we're not saying, we're not condemning any side, we're giving students this information. They can use it as they wish for either party or for a new party. These are just the ways in which we see the elections are being stolen. And we had a number of experts and professors from major universities who are in this field, and they talked about how easy it is to flip these votes and erase them and do all sorts of tricks with them. And this is just not getting the attention. But this is one now of many, because since that time, the Republicans can't steal enough votes in those ways, so they've added the different techniques in the ways that have gotten a lot of publicity in recent years. But so our democracy is being very badly undermined, and I think socialists, including Marxists, really favor a working democracy much more than those who are talking so much about it and the need to spread democracy around the world. I think all that is hypocritical poppycrap.
Well, you're doing a good job, Bertell, at doing that, and so is Richard Wolff, and lots of people are going to his lectures, and you mentioned Mark Crispin Miller. He gave a talk to the club I belong to, the Village Independent Democrats, which is in this neighborhood, the Village. And one thing about this club, this Democratic club, which is pretty far to the left in terms of how Democrats go, for the first time in its history this year, this November, the club endorsed a Green Party candidate for governor, Howie Hawkins, instead of the Democratic candidate, the centrist Democrat, you could even say center-right, Andrew Cuomo. And I was on the streets campaigning for Howie Hawkins, and it was amazing the response that you got from people, especially middle-aged people in this neighborhood in the Village. They seem to be very bright, and they, Democrats who are switching over to the Green Party because they really feel so frustrated. But a lot of the younger people would just walk past me, with the iPods in their ears, and they have very apathetic about the political process and what's going on. So we have a lot of work cut out for us, right? We have a lot of work cut out for us. With the time left in our program, we want to move towards hope and solutions using the dialectical method. How can we get more people to know what this is? I'm a person who believes in the power of dialogue. Certainly our television show promotes human dialogue. And is there a connection also between dialogue and dialectic, between engaging people in these conversations? Is that also a dialectic?
Well, the word dialectic goes back, as you know, a long way. The ancient Greeks tended to associate it with two people, primarily Socrates, because of the way he conducted his discussions. And they were started with people holding different positions, exchanged their points of view, and they usually worked toward one solution, which was what Socrates had in his back pocket all along, and the other would often, agree with it. I think a better approach to dialectics you see in another Greek philosopher of that general period, a man called Heraclitus. He's the one who, and there's very little of his writings left, but what there is very provocative. He's the one who said you can't walk into the same river twice. That the second time you try to walk into the river, enough water has flown by that it's no longer the same river. It was a way of saying everything is changing, and that you better think of that whenever you're dealing with problems in the present, because it's not going to be like that. Now, it's maybe not changing as fast as the water goes by in a river, but you have to think about what it's becoming. And the word becoming has been a very important word for thinking dialectically. Everything is in the process of becoming, and the past, whatever it was, has gone on to become the present, and the present is going on to become something else, obviously, in the future. And one has to keep this in mind in studying anything. And now the second big aspect of dialectics.
I just want to respond to that by talking about Carl Rogers. I consider myself a Rogerian. Rogers wrote a book called On Becoming a Person. And this idea of, is it true that dialectic has to do with change and interaction? Like you and I are having this conversation, and yet we're becoming different here. Both of us, and the viewers watching us can also become different from watching this conversation and then going forward in the conversations they have in their lives.
Well, and that's part of it. But the other half, just half. But the other half is equally important, and that is that everything is in complex relations with virtually everything else. And I'm talking not just about direct relations, but indirect relations. And these relations may be very trivial and only important through a number of intermediary steps. But you have to keep this in mind too. So what we're really talking about, we talk about reality. We're talking about constant interaction that's occurring between an infinite number of relations, and this goes on not only in every sphere but between spheres. And now, this is important to keep in mind as somehow the basis, because then the crucial question is not connecting the dots, but where do the dots come from? And the dots that is the pieces that you're trying to, in any attempt to understand something, you're making connections. But what you are making connections between are not always obvious, and we play a role in establishing those dots. And they don't simply exist in nature as finished dots in their finished form, especially when we're talking about society. So people are always extracting out of the world, their world, certain relations and treating them as a basis for making connections. And then the connections which are made are supposed to come together in some vision of the whole. So the whole, which in dialectics is often referred to as the totality, is terribly important, because once that gets established as through these interconnections which together bring forth a distinctive whole, then it acquires a kind of movement, because everything is moving, and that means the whole, and the whole then has a certain reverse interaction on the very elements which compose it. So there's an interaction now going on not just between the parts, but between the parts and the whole. And this is something which we have to try to get a hold of. Now, much of the rest of dialectics has to do with sometimes with like vocabulary, which is a little difficult, like contradiction or quality change, which is really not that difficult to understand if you realize that what they're trying to do is to capture a pattern inside that flow. Inside that interaction, all of those different categories. And what this enables you to do is to grasp something like capitalism in a way which does justice to its origins and how it became what it is, without which you can't understand what it is, but then taking this past of capitalism plus its present and seeing them as a becoming. You can make projections which are not predictions, but which are projections of a likely future made up of things which are already here. Because if looking at the present, you see that elements of the present have existed in the past. So therefore, elements of the future are going to exist in the present. And we can study the present in such a way so as to highlight those elements and make projections. And make projections of who will be necessary in order to bring this about, to come to your practical solutions. The only way it can come about is that the majority of the people who work, because these kinds of civilizational changes, and this is what we're talking about, not a change in the American government or any particular government, we're talking about a civilization. The world has to change. Capitalism is now global. And it can only be done when enough of the people who work for a living, who are, and I'm not just talking about factory workers, people who have to sell their labor power in order to make enough money to survive, when enough of those, that 95% of the population, when enough of them understand that their situation is getting worse, and that at the same time that the conditions for a totally different, much more humane and satisfying society is possible to create, are able to get together politically. A new political party has to be created, which is a workers' political party. I like the Greens a lot, that I know about them, but I do think that the only kind of change which would be civilizational, which is what's needed now, not just a change in the names of the people who are serving the capitalist class, like the Social Democrats are in various countries where they are in control. They don't really change capitalism. They make it a bit more livable. Well, that requires a group of people who need that kind of civilizational change in order to create. There isn't a compromise for them, because capitalism allows only minimal, as we see the Social Democrats now in places where they're in power, like France. There's very little they can do because the capitalists don't allow it. the capitalists will not invest, as happened when Mitterrand tried to do something back in the 1980s in France. Or they put the squeeze on them in one another way, or they send their money outside their country, or they sabotage in one way or another, or they bribe the people that they can bribe. That, in fact, that wealth has to be removed from the capitalist class. They have to be made ex-capitalists, and this doesn't, not referring to small grocery stores, not referring to little, small businesses, but basically the system has to be taken over by the people democratically and used for the people, and it would be a civilizational change. And I'm afraid that the little moves which are made by progressives, which don't have as an aim to try to come together with a party which organizes people on their common identity as workers. I'm afraid too many people in the parties like the Greens and others, which are doing a lot of good work, that they've organized people on their identity, not the workers, and therefore the problems that workers have can't be the basis of bringing together the large majority, which is potentially available for making the civilizational change that we all so badly need. I worked a lot into there, but you let me know that we don't have all that much time to talk.
Well, Claudia has given us the 10-minute sign, the 10-minute warning we got. Oh, actually 6 minutes, 6 minutes. So I think this was very enriching for our viewers and for Claudia and I to hear this discourse from you, Bertell. I just want to say that I actually I'm friendly with a student of yours, Bertram Miller, who took your class, and now he has this group that he calls it the Politics for Human Community that meets in local diners, and we get together on a monthly basis to discuss politics and also to discuss our lives, and it's a very therapeutic and also a very politically nurturing space, and I always feel thankful for you because, he was educated from you, and also Francis Fox Piven was one of his professors. Back in Hoboken in 2002, Claudia and I live in Hoboken, and this show is also being broadcast not only in Manhattan, but also in Hoboken and Hudson County. So I think a lot of folks are going to get an education in Marxism that they might not have gotten in the past, because of the lacks in our education system, let's say. Back in 2002, I created an open conversation group that basically was radically open, and anybody could come. It was at a bookstore. It was on a Wednesday night from 6 o'clock to 8 o'clock, and we just sat around and discussed our lives and discussed culture and issues of the day. And it found, but it was a space where people could actually vent a lot of the frustrations and the feelings that they were having about being overworked and about the problems in the system. I really think we really need more spaces that people can come together and discuss these things, and an educational program going forward. What advice could you give to our viewers and to Claudia and I in terms of how we can grow stronger in our awareness of what's going on and be able to discuss these things with people? Because as we see now, there's such polarization, it's very difficult to bring these topics up, even at family gatherings. If you say anything about socialism, it's like they brand you as, this is no good. And how do we work these elements in a way, and how do you, speak to that?
One of the problems I've had some of the problems that you raised at the end of your comments. When I had interviews in the past, when there was a Soviet Union and a so-called communist China, most of the questions would be directed to, why am I defending these people who are sending dissidents to gulags and things of that sort? I don't get those questions anymore. But it's important still to say something that I gave as an answer, which is that what Marx believed was an absolutely essential precondition for the kind of socialism in plenty that he thought was possible, indeed likely, was that capitalism had already produced most of the wealth and technology and education, albeit of a mostly distorted kind, that was necessary as a foundation for building such a socialism, that you couldn't build socialism in poor societies which didn't have much technology, which didn't have much of a literate public, in fact. And what happened in Russia and in China is that the revolutions occurred in poor societies. Now, in Russia's case, they had made their revolution in the hopes, and I think believed it was quite likely that there was going to be similar revolutions in Europe coming out of World War I. And they weren't completely wrong. So revolutions happened in part. In Germany, for example, as many as 12 cities, including Berlin, were under the control of the workers in those cities for periods of up to 2 weeks. Hungary had a communist government for 3 months coming out of World War I. So that almost happened. But then what did happen of that sort in the more developed capitalist countries was overturned, and they had a choice of what to do. Now, I think that was a terrible problem for them. And what they tried to do was, in some ways, the best they could. They made terrible mistakes. I won't go into what I think were the big ones. But and China the same, but they really couldn't do what Marx said would be done and could be done based upon what capitalism has created before. Now, capitalism can no longer do this. And besides, there was a huge cost to be paid for all that, including slavery and much else of destruction. But meanwhile, that now is there for us, so that we must look at socialism and communism in terms of what does it have to say as an alternative for dealing with today's problems in the globalized world in which we all live. That's the context in which it needs to be looked at.
We're almost out of time. I also want to give a shout out to NYU, my alma mater, where I earned a master's degree in English education, for having a wonderful intellectual like Bertell Ollman here on board, and also to let it be known that Bertell is the winner of the Lifetime Achievement Award of a very prestigious political science association, the National Association of Political Scientists, which one time had Woodrow Wilson as a member, down at DuPont Circle in Washington, D.C. No, you are being accepted, my friend.
It's a subsection.
Yeah, but it's still...
It's not the whole association.
Okay,
I don't want them to think that I'm claiming the presidency of the APSA. It was a subsection of the American political science.
Maybe you're more beloved than you realize, that people do accept your ideas, and these, got to go out to a bigger audience, of course, and we want our audience to stay strong with their politics, and certainly keep open the idea that Marxism is a viable alternative. And we thank you, Bertell, for keeping the spirit of Marxism and the ideas of Marx alive more than anybody, I think, in terms of dialectics, and you are the man, okay? So thank you, Bertell, and all the best.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.